September 8, 1943. The sky above the industrial heart of northern France stretched thin and brittle, a canvas of pale blue interrupted only by contrails and the distant smudge of smoke rising from the Seine Valley. At 27,000 feet, Oberleutnant Friedrich Mesner of Jagdgeschwader 26 adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon through the canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109. His squadron had been scrambled to intercept a formation of American bombers heading toward the munitions factories near Rouen, and Mesner felt the familiar tension coiling in his chest, equal parts anticipation and calculation. Then he saw them, a formation of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, their bulky silhouettes unmistakable against the morning Sunday. Mesner allowed himself a thin smile. These were the aircraft his comrades had taken to calling Jugs, short for Juggernaut, though the nickname carried more mockery than respect. The Thunderbolts were enormous, their radial engines jutting forward like the snout of some prehistoric beast, their wings thick and heavy. They looked slow, they looked vulnerable, and when German pilots had first encountered them months earlier, they had laughed. But Mesner was not laughing anymore. He had read the intelligence reports. He had heard the rumors filtering back from pilots who had engaged these American machines and barely escaped. The Thunderbolts could dive. Not just dive, they could accelerate in a near-vertical plunge at speeds that defied logic, speeds that turned the sky into a weapon, speeds that made retreat impossible. All units, prepare to engage. Mesner radioed to his wingmen, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his thoughts. Remember, do not let them gain altitude advantage. Do not let them dive on you. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. The Americans had already climbed higher. They were already positioning themselves for the kill, and when a Thunderbolt dove, there was no outrunning it. For the Luftwaffe pilots, who had grown accustomed to dictating the terms of aerial combat over occupied Europe, the realization was slowly, brutally dawning. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just another fighter. It was a falling anvil with guns, and when it dropped from altitude, it turned retreat into a death sentence. In the spring of 1943, the war in the skies over Europe had entered a phase of grim attrition. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, now found itself stretched thin across multiple fronts. Their pilots were experienced, their tactics honed through years of combat over Britain, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. They flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190 aircraft, renowned for their agility, climb rate, and turning performance. These were fighters built for the dogfight, for the close-in knife fight where skill and reflexes determined survival. The German doctrine was elegant in its simplicity. Gain altitude, dive on the enemy, strike hard, then climb away using superior engine power and maneuverability to escape before the opponent could respond. It was a tactic that had devastated Spitfires, Hurricanes, and early American fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots called it energy fighting, using vertical maneuvers to conserve speed and momentum, trading altitude for velocity in carefully calculated attacks. But by mid-1943, a new adversary had appeared in the European theatre, and it was forcing the Germans to reconsider everything they thought they knew about air combat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was, by any measure, an absurdity. At 10,000 pounds empty and over 17,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, radial engine 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, generated over 2,000 horsepower, but even that massive engine seemed barely adequate to haul the aircraft's bulk through the sky. The fuselage was broad and ungainly, the wings thick and stubby compared to the sleek lines of German fighters. When British pilots first saw the Thunderbolt, they joked that a pilot could defend himself by running around inside the fuselage and hiding. American pilots, fresh from training in the States, approached the aircraft with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group remembered his first impression. It was like comparing a Mack truck to a sports car. The Spitfire pilots looked at us like we'd been given a punishment detail. The P-47 climbed slowly, painfully slowly, compared to the Bf-109. Its turning radius was wide, its acceleration sluggish at low altitudes. In a traditional dogfight, a skilled German pilot in a lighter fighter could run circles around a Thunderbolt, exploiting every advantage of agility and climb rate. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers who first studied captured gun camera footage and interrogation reports from downed American pilots came to a comforting conclusion. The Thunderbolt was a stopgap measure, an overbuilt escort fighter that posed little threat in actual combat. The reports described it as heavy, slow to maneuver, vulnerable in turning engagements. One Luftwaffe pilot wrote in his diary after an early encounter, "The Americans have sent us pregnant cows. They fly like cargo planes with guns." But buried in those same intelligence reports were fragments of information that should have given the Germans pause. References to exceptional dive performance, mentions of structural integrity under high-speed stress, notes about pilots who had been caught from above and found themselves unable to escape, unable to outrun an aircraft that by all rights should have been too heavy to chase them. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, understood what the Luftwaffe did not yet grasp. The P-47 was not designed to outturn German fighters. It was designed to outdive them, out-accelerate them in a vertical plunge, and most importantly, to survive the crushing forces of a 500-mile-per-hour dive that would tear the wings off a Messerschmitt. Zemke had been a combat observer with the Royal Air Force in 1940 and had watched Spitfire pilots struggle against the Bf-109's superior climb rate and dive capability. He knew that traditional dogfighting tactics would get his men killed, so he developed something different, something the Luftwaffe was not prepared for. He called it boom and zoom. The concept was brutally simple. Use the P-47's excellent high-altitude performance to climb above the enemy. Maintain an energy advantage. Altitude equals potential energy. Speed equals kinetic energy. Then dive. Not a shallow diving attack, but a screaming, near-vertical plunge that converted all that stored altitude into raw, unstoppable velocity. Strike the enemy with overwhelming firepower from the Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns. Then use the momentum from the dive to zoom climb back to altitude before the enemy could react. It required discipline, it required patience, and it required absolute faith in the aircraft's structural integrity. In the cockpit of a P-47, the experience of a full-power dive was unlike anything most pilots had ever encountered. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and cold. The turbo supercharger hummed beneath the cowling, feeding compressed air to the massive radial engine. When a pilot rolled inverted and pulled the nose down into a vertical dive, gravity and engine power combined into something that felt less like flying and more like falling with intent. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The control surfaces stiffened as the airspeed increased, the stick becoming heavier in the pilot's hands. At 450 miles per hour, the airframe began to vibrate, a deep, thrumming resonance that travelled through the fuselage and into the pilot's bones. But the P-47 held together. Its thick wings, designed with a robust internal structure, absorbed the aerodynamic forces. The radial engine, with its massive crankcase and sturdy mounting, remained solid, and the pilot, strapped into an armoured seat with a thick, bulletproof windscreen in front of him, felt the reassuring solidity of a machine built to withstand punishment. At 500 miles per hour, a speed approaching the compressibility limits of propeller-driven aircraft, the P-47 was still controllable. The stick was nearly immovable, requiring both hands to make even small corrections, but the aircraft responded. It dove straight. It dove true, and when it intercepted an enemy fighter, the closing speed was so overwhelming that German pilots barely had time to react before 850 caliber machine guns opened fire. Lieutenant Harold Comstock of the 63rd Fighter Group experienced the P-47's dive capability firsthand during a test flight on November 13, 1942. Flying at 30,000 feet, Comstock and his wingman Roger Dyer put their P-47Cs into a full-power dive to test performance at the next altitude level. Within seconds, their airspeed indicators showed readings equivalent to 725 miles per hour. The aircraft shook violently as they approached the edge of compressibility, the realm where airflow over the wings began to behave unpredictably, where shock waves formed and control surfaces stiffened to the point of immobility. Both pilots experienced what they later described as the airplane trying to shake itself apart. The control sticks locked solid. Standard flight controls were useless, but the P-47 had been designed with this possibility in mind. Comstock and Dyer used the emergency trim tabs, small manual cranks that adjusted the elevator trim directly to gradually pull the aircraft out of the dive. The recovery took every ounce of strength and every second of altitude they had, but both pilots brought their Thunderbolts back to level flight. The aircraft were intact. Not a single structural component had failed. When they landed and reported the dive, the engineering teams at Republic Aviation were both horrified and vindicated. Horrified that pilots had pushed the aircraft to such extremes, vindicated that the P-47's design had held together under forces that would have disintegrated any other fighter in the world. The incident became legendary among P-47 pilots. It proved that the Thunderbolt could dive at speeds no German fighter could match and survive. For the Luftwaffe, this was not yet common knowledge in early 1943, but they were about to learn. The first combat engagement that demonstrated the P-47's dive capability occurred on May 4, 1943, when the 56th Fighter Group escorted B-17 Flying Fortresses to Antwerp. Major Don Blakesley led the formation of Thunderbolts, maintaining a position 5,000 feet above the bomber stream. The tactical advantage was deliberate altitude meant energy, and energy meant life. Oberleutnant Hans Priller of JG-26, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders, spotted the American formation from his patrol altitude of 20,000 feet. He counted 12 Thunderbolts flying top cover, their silhouettes unmistakable even at distance. Priller smiled. The Americans were maintaining altitude, which meant they were cautious. Cautious was predictable. Predictable meant vulnerable. All units prepare for climbing attack, Priller radioed. The standard Luftwaffe tactic. Climb to gain energy, then dive through the escort to strike the bombers. The Bf-109s could climb faster than the Thunderbolts. Once through the escort, they could hit the bombers and then dive away before the Americans could respond. It was a tactic that had worked countless times before. Priller's squadron began their climb, engines straining as they gained altitude. But as they passed through 23,000 feet, something unexpected happened. The Thunderbolts dove, not the shallow, calculated dive of an intercept. This was a near-vertical plunge, all 12 aircraft rolling inverted and dropping like stones toward the climbing Messerschmitts. The closing speed was staggering. One moment, the Thunderbolts were distant specks above. The next, they were roaring past at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, their machine guns blazing. Priller's wingman, Lieutenant Otto Becker, broke formation instinctively, rolling hard to avoid the stream of tracer fire that arced past his canopy. But the Thunderbolt that had fired at him didn't follow into the turn. It couldn't at that speed. Turning was impossible. Instead, the P-47 flashed past and disappeared below, converting its dive speed into a zoom climb that carried it back above the German formation before Becker could even process what had happened. 2 Messerschmitts were hit in that first pass. One spiraled down trailing smoke, its pilot struggling with a damaged engine. The other simply disintegrated, its wing torn off by concentrated .50 caliber fire at point-blank range. And then the Thunderbolts were gone, climbing back to altitude with the momentum they had gained in the dive. Priller, shaken but alive, tried to follow. His Bf-109 had an excellent climb rate, one of the best in the world. He pushed the throttle to maximum power and pulled the nose up, expecting to pursue the Americans. But the Thunderbolts were already 5,000 feet above him, already reforming, already preparing for another diving attack. "Impossible," Priller muttered into his oxygen mask. "That is impossible." The Messerschmitt was lighter. It had a better power-to-weight ratio. It should have been able to climb faster than the heavy American fighter. but the P-47 had begun its zoom climb from a speed of over 400 miles per hour speed it had gained in the dive. The Messerschmitt, starting its climb from near stall speed after breaking formation, couldn't match that energy. The laws of physics were indifferent to reputation. The Thunderbolt had converted altitude into speed, then converted that speed back into altitude, and in doing so had negated every advantage the German fighter possessed. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. When it was over, JG-26 had lost 4 aircraft with 2 more damaged. The American bomber formation continued unmolested to its target, and every P-47 returned to base. That evening, Priller filed his combat report with a sense of disbelief that bordered on anger. The American escort fighter demonstrates dive performance that exceeds our current intelligence assessments, he wrote. Recommend immediate tactical revision for engagements above 20,000 feet. Standard energy tactics ineffective against this aircraft. But tactical revisions took time, and the Luftwaffe was about to face an opponent that had been specifically designed to exploit the one advantage German fighters could not counter: terminal velocity. By June 1943, word of the Thunderbolt's dive capability had begun to spread through Luftwaffe fighter units. Pilots who had engaged the P-47 and survived brought back reports that were consistent and troubling. The American fighter could outdive anything in the sky. Attempts to escape by diving away a tactic that had saved countless German lives against Spitfires and early P-42s now resulted in swift death. Kurt Bühligen, a high-scoring German ace with 112 victories, later recalled the frustration of those early encounters. The P-47 was very heavy, he said in post-war interviews. Too heavy for some maneuvers. We would see it coming from behind and pull up fast, and the P-47 couldn't follow. We came around and got on its tail this way. It was the standard defensive maneuver: use superior climb rate to gain altitude, then reverse the engagement. It worked, but it only worked if the American pilot chose to follow into the climb. Increasingly, they did not. Instead, P-47 pilots who found themselves in a turning engagement would simply roll inverted and dive away. And once the dive began, there was no catching them. Lieutenant Samuel Peters of the 335th Fighter Squadron described the tactic in his mission notes. The key is to never get drawn into a turning fight. The moment you feel yourself losing energy, break off, dive, use your speed. They can't follow you. They physically cannot follow you. The emphasis was deliberate. It wasn't that German pilots lacked skill or courage. It was that their aircraft, magnificent as they were, had structural and aerodynamic limits that the Thunderbolt had been specifically designed to exceed. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 had a maximum dive speed of approximately 460 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, before encountering severe control problems. Beyond that speed, the elevator became nearly immovable, and the aircraft had a tendency to tuck under into an unrecoverable dive. Luftwaffe training manuals explicitly warned pilots not to exceed 450 miles per hour in a dive. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was slightly better, with a placard dive limit of around 470 miles per hour, but even that was pushing the structural limits of the airframe. The P-47 Thunderbolt had a placard dive limit of 500 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, and that was a conservative limit, established to provide a safety margin. Pilots routinely exceeded it in combat and returned home with their aircraft intact. The difference was not trivial. In a vertical dive from 25,000 feet, a P-47 accelerated so rapidly that it could gain a 100 mile per hour speed advantage over a pursuing Messerschmitt in less than 10 seconds. That speed differential translated into distance that grew with every second. By the time the German pilot recognized he couldn't catch the Thunderbolt and tried to pull out of the dive, the American was already 2 miles ahead and beginning his zoom climb back to altitude. It was a paradigm shift in aerial combat. For the first time, American pilots had an aircraft that allowed them to disengage from a fight at will. They could choose when to attack and when to retreat, and the Germans, accustomed to being the ones who dictated the terms of engagement, found themselves reacting rather than acting. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was profound. Oberleutnant Hermann König, stationed near Rouen in September 1943, recorded his experiences in a diary that was later captured by Allied forces. One entry from September 12 reads, "Engaged 8 Thunderbolts at altitude today. Standard intercept, climb to advantage, dive on formation. But they saw us coming. They always see us coming. The moment we committed to the attack, half their formation rolled and dove on us from above. Closing speed was insane. My wingman, Müller, tried to dive away. He was the fastest pilot in the squadron. It didn't matter. The Americans stayed with him, firing in controlled bursts. Müller's aircraft disintegrated at 4,000 meters. I pulled up instead, climbed as hard as I could. The Thunderbolt didn't follow. It didn't have to. We broke off the engagement. The bombers continued unmolested. We lost 3 aircraft. They lost none." König's account captures the helplessness German pilots were beginning to feel. Traditional tactics, the tactics that had dominated European skies for 3 years, were becoming obsolete. The P-47 had introduced a new equation. Altitude plus mass plus engine power equals an energy advantage that could not be overcome by agility alone. And there was another factor the Germans had not anticipated: American pilot training. The pilots of the 56th, 78th, and 355th Fighter Groups were not the inexperienced novices the Luftwaffe had initially assumed. They were products of an industrial nation's systematic approach to warfare. Each pilot had hundreds of hours of flight time before entering combat. They had been trained on the P-47's specific characteristics, drilled endlessly on energy management, taught to think in terms of potential and kinetic energy rather than turning radius. Colonel Zemke's training doctrine emphasized patience and discipline. "You don't dogfight in a Thunderbolt," he told his pilots during briefings. "You position yourself above the enemy. You wait for the right moment, and then you strike with overwhelming force and disengage before they can respond. This is not chivalry. This is industrial warfare. We have more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition. We use those advantages." The doctrine was cold, calculated, and devastatingly effective. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late summer of 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence had compiled enough combat reports to recognize the pattern. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not simply a heavy escort fighter. It was a purpose-built energy fighter optimized for high-altitude combat and boom and zoom tactics. German fighter tactics were revised to emphasize avoiding engagement above 20,000 feet unless numerical superiority was overwhelming. But tactical revisions on paper did not change the reality in the cockpit. German pilots still had to intercept American bomber formations. They still had to climb to engagement altitude, and when they did, the Thunderbolts were waiting. September 8, 1943, the day Friedrich Mesner led his squadron into the intercept that opened this story would become a case study in the P-47's dominance. Mesner's squadron had 12 Messerschmitts. They were experienced pilots, veterans of multiple campaigns. They climbed aggressively, hoping to reach the bomber stream before the escort could react. But Major Donald Blee, leading the 335th Fighter Squadron's formation of 16 P-47 seconds, had positioned his aircraft at 28,000 feet, 3,000 feet above the Germans. He watched through his canopy as the Messerschmitts climbed into range. "Wolfpack, this is lead," Blee radioed. "Bandits at 6 o'clock low, climbing. We have altitude advantage. Execute standard boom and zoom on my mark." The Thunderbolts rolled inverted in perfect formation. 16 radial engines roared as the pilots pushed throttles to maximum power, and then they dove. From Mesner's perspective, it was like watching an avalanche. One moment the Americans were distant specks above. The next, they were screaming down at a combined closing speed that exceeded 700 miles per hour. The dive was catastrophic for the Germans. Not because of surprise Mesner had seen the Thunderbolts at altitude and had even anticipated the attack, but because of the sheer, overwhelming speed at which the Americans descended. Lieutenant William Hartman, flying number 3 in the formation, felt his P-47 accelerate as if pushed by an invisible hand. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 27,000 feet, 25,000, 23,000. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, then 420, 440. The control stick grew heavier in his hands, requiring both palms to make even minor adjustments. The windscreen vibrated, the engine roared, and through it all, the Thunderbolt remained stable, locked into a trajectory that no Messerschmitt could match. Mesner's squadron scattered. The German pilots, recognizing the danger too late, broke formation in multiple directions. Some attempted to climb a reflexive defensive maneuver that might have worked against Spitfires. Others dove, hoping to escape downward using their lighter weight as an advantage. Neither tactic worked. The Thunderbolts that had targeted the climbing Messerschmitts simply adjusted their angle of attack, maintaining their dive while tracking their targets. The closing speed was so overwhelming that the German pilots barely had time to register the tracer fire before their aircraft were torn apart. One Bf-109 simply disintegrated, its wing separating from the fuselage as 50 caliber rounds stitched across the wing root. The pilots who dove fared no better. They accelerated rapidly at first, their lighter aircraft responding well to the initial descent. But as they passed 400 miles per hour, the aerodynamic forces began to work against them. The Messerschmitt's controls stiffened, the elevator became increasingly difficult to move, and at 440 miles per hour, one pilot attempting to level out found his control stick completely locked. He pulled with all his strength, but the aircraft refused to respond. It simply continued diving, accelerating toward the ground in an unrecoverable plunge. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolts behind him maintained formation. At 460 miles per hour, a speed that would have been suicidal for a German fighter, the P-47 seconds remained controllable. Heavy, yes. Difficult to maneuver, absolutely. But flyable. The pilot who had been chasing the now doomed Messerschmitt simply held his dive angle, watched the German aircraft impact the ground in a fireball, and then smoothly pulled back on his stick, using the trim tabs to assist. The Thunderbolt's nose came up gradually, converting dive speed into altitude in a zoom climb that carried it back above the remaining German formation. Major Blee, observing from his command position, radioed calmly, "Wolfpack, reform at Angels 2-7. Good kills. Maintain energy advantage." The entire engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds. 4 Messerschmitts destroyed, 3 more damaged and fleeing toward German-held territory. 0 American losses. For Friedrich Mesner, the experience was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. He had survived barely by pulling into a steep climb the moment he saw the Thunderbolts commit to their dive. His Messerschmitt's superior climb rate had allowed him to gain altitude while the Americans were committed to their attack. But when he looked around, half his squadron was gone, and the Thunderbolts were already back at altitude, reforming for another pass. "All units, disengage," Mesner ordered, his voice tight with frustration. "Return to base." It was not cowardice, it was calculation. To remain in the combat zone was to invite annihilation. The Americans had demonstrated something that German intelligence had warned about, but that most pilots had refused to believe. The Thunderbolt could dive at speeds that made retreat impossible. The implications of this capability rippled through Luftwaffe tactical planning in the weeks that followed. At Fighter Command headquarters near Paris, intelligence officers studied combat reports with growing alarm. The pattern was unmistakable. German pilots attempting to escape from American fighters by diving away a tactic that had been reliable since the Battle of Britain were now being caught and destroyed with disturbing regularity. Hauptmann Otto Schmidt, a veteran pilot instructor, reviewed the data during a commander's briefing in mid-September. "The Americans have fundamentally changed the equation," he stated, pointing to a chart showing engagement outcomes. "Our fighters, both the 109 and the 190, have maximum dive speeds around 460 miles per hour before structural or control problems become critical. The Thunderbolt can exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive and remain controllable." One officer interrupted. But surely their heavier weight means they lose energy faster in a climb? Schmidt nodded. In a sustained climb from level flight, yes. But they're not climbing from level flight. They're converting dive speed into altitude. A Thunderbolt that dives from 30,000 feet to 20,000 feet reaches speeds in excess of 450 miles per hour. When it pulls out of that dive and begins climbing, it maintains that speed for several thousand feet of altitude gain. By the time it slows to our climb speed, it's already back at 25,000 feet or higher. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. So we cannot dive away from them, another officer said slowly. And if we climb, they simply dive again. What are our options? Schmidt's expression was grim. Avoid engagement above 20,000 feet, unless we have overwhelming numerical superiority. If engaged, do not attempt to dive away. Maintain horizontal maneuvers and attempt to force them into turning fights where our agility advantage remains. It was sound tactical advice. But it also represented a fundamental shift in German air doctrine. For 3 years, Luftwaffe fighters had controlled the vertical dimension of air combat. They had used altitude and dive speed as weapons, striking from above and escaping before the enemy could respond. Now, for the first time, they faced an opponent who dominated the vertical even more completely than they did. For American pilots, the psychological impact of this capability was profound. Lieutenant Robert Johnson described it in a letter home to his family. The Germans used to own the dive. They'd hit us and then drop away before we could get our guns on them. But now, in the Jug, we're the ones who can control the fight. If we have altitude, we can engage or disengage at will. The Germans know it. You can see the hesitation when they spot us above them. They know that diving away means death. The confidence this engendered translated into increasingly aggressive tactics. P-47 squadrons began conducting what they called hunter-killer sweeps, flying ahead of bomber formations, specifically to seek out and destroy German interceptors before they could reach the bombers. The tactic required patience and discipline. American pilots would climb to maximum altitude, sometimes 30,000 feet or higher, and patrol likely intercept routes. When German fighters appeared below them, climbing to intercept the incoming bombers, the Thunderbolts would dive. The results were devastating. On October 16, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group executed a textbook hunter-killer sweep near Schweinfurt. 12 P-47 seconds at 29,000 feet spotted a formation of 18 FW-190s, climbing to intercept B-17 seconds. The Thunderbolts rolled into their dive, accelerating rapidly. By the time the Germans recognized the threat, the Americans were already at terminal velocity. The engagement was over in minutes. 7 FW-190s destroyed, 4 more damaged. The German formation scattered, abandoning their intercept entirely. The bombers completed their mission unmolested. Not a single P-47 was lost. Captain David Schilling, who led the attack, described the tactic in his after-action report. Altitude is everything. If we maintain the high ground, we can strike with impunity. The Germans have excellent pilots and excellent aircraft, but physics doesn't care about skill. When we dive at 500 miles per hour, there is no escape. They cannot outrun us, cannot outclimb us, cannot turn inside our trajectory. All they can do is die or run. It was brutal, it was efficient, and it was the logical conclusion of a design philosophy that prioritized energy over elegance. The human cost of this tactical shift became apparent in German casualty reports. By November 1943, Luftwaffe fighter losses over France had increased by 40% compared to the previous 6 months. Experienced pilots, men who had survived years of combat, were being shot down at alarming rates. The primary cause, according to post-mission interrogations of captured pilots, was inability to disengage from American fighters. One captured Oberleutnant, interviewed at a British interrogation facility, described his final mission with haunting clarity. "We saw the Thunderbolts above us. We knew what would happen. But we had orders to intercept the bombers, so we climbed. When they dove on us, I pushed my stick forward immediately. Full power. Emergency dive. I thought perhaps I could reach ground level before they caught me. My airspeed reached 470 miles per hour. I could barely control the aircraft. The stick was like iron, and still, the American was faster. I watched him close the distance. I saw his guns firing. I felt the impacts on my fuselage. My engine failed. I bailed out at 3,000 meters. My wingman was not so fortunate. These accounts accumulated in Allied intelligence files, providing a detailed picture of how the P-47's dive capability was psychologically destroying German morale. Pilots who survived encounters with Thunderbolts returned to base shaken, reluctant to engage American fighters again. Some requested transfers to other theaters. Others simply refused to fly offensive patrols above 20,000 feet. Luftwaffe commanders attempted to address the problem through tactical innovations. They experimented with layered defensive formations, some fighters maintaining high altitude while others patrolled lower, hoping to catch Thunderbolts during their zoom climbs. They tried coordinated attacks from multiple angles, hoping to overwhelm the Americans' formation. Discipline. They even attempted to lure P-47 seconds into extended engagements over German-held territory, hoping to force them to land due to fuel exhaustion. None of these tactics proved consistently effective. The fundamental problem remained. The Thunderbolt could accelerate to speeds in a dive that made pursuit impossible, and it could sustain damage that would destroy any German fighter. Combining these two characteristics created an aircraft that was nearly invulnerable when flown correctly. The engineering behind this capability was remarkable but not mysterious. The P-47's designers at Republic Aviation had understood from the beginning that high-altitude escort missions would require an aircraft capable of operating in the thin air above 25,000 feet. To achieve this, they built the Thunderbolt around the largest and most powerful radial engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, and paired it with a sophisticated turbo supercharger system that maintained engine power at altitude. But the designers also recognized that weight was inevitable. The engine alone weighed over 2,000 pounds. The turbo supercharger system added more weight. 8 50-caliber machine guns and ammunition added more still. Armor plating for the cockpit and engine, self-sealing fuel tanks, robust landing gear capable of handling hard landings. All of this drove the aircraft's loaded weight to over 17,000 pounds. Rather than fight against this weight, the designers embraced it. They strengthened the airframe to handle the stresses of high-speed flight. They designed the wings with a robust internal structure capable of withstanding aerodynamic loads that would tear apart lighter aircraft. They tested the control surfaces at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, ensuring that pilots would retain authority even at terminal velocity. The result was an aircraft that could do something no other fighter in the world could match. Dive at over 500 miles per hour and pull out safely. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, one of the highest-scoring American aces in Europe, explained the significance in a post-war interview. The Germans had better turning fighters. Their 109s could climb faster than we could, but none of that mattered if we controlled the altitude. We'd position ourselves above them, wait for the right moment, and then dive. Once we committed to the dive, the fight was over. They couldn't catch us, couldn't escape us, couldn't do anything except try to survive. That psychological advantage, knowing that we controlled when and how the fight would happen, was worth more than any mechanical advantage they had. By December 1943, the tactical landscape over Western Europe had fundamentally shifted. Luftwaffe fighter operations increasingly focused on low-altitude intercepts and night-fighting theaters, where the P-47's high-altitude advantages were less relevant. German pilots developed a healthy respect bordering on fear of encountering Thunderbolts above 20,000 feet. American bomber crews, meanwhile, flew with growing confidence. The presence of P-47 escorts meant that German interceptors had to fight through a screen of fighters that could dive at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Every German pilot who attempted to reach the bombers risked being caught in a dive he could not escape. The strategic implications extended beyond individual missions. The P-47's ability to dominate high-altitude combat allowed American bomber formations to strike deep into Germany with acceptable loss rates. Factories, rail yards, and oil refineries, targets that had been effectively protected by German air defenses, now became vulnerable. Each successful bombing raid degraded Germany's industrial capacity, accelerating the erosion of the Luftwaffe's ability to replace losses. Oberleutnant Hans Priller, reflecting the evolution of air combat in late 1943, wrote in his diary, "The Americans have solved a problem we never anticipated. They built an aircraft too heavy to dogfight, too large to hide, too slow to climb. And yet, by embracing these limitations and exploiting altitude and dive speed, they created something that dominates the sky. We mock the Thunderbolt's appearance, but we fear its dive. That dive has killed more of our pilots than any other American tactic. It is a weapon we cannot counter except by avoiding engagement entirely." As 1944 approached, the P-47 Thunderbolts' reputation was secure. It was no longer the Jug that German pilots had laughed at in the spring of 1943. It was the falling anvil, the unstoppable force, the aircraft that turned retreat into a death sentence. American pilots had learned to exploit its strengths with ruthless efficiency. German pilots had learned to respect its capabilities with bitter experience. And the skies over Europe had been transformed by a simple truth that Republic Aviation's engineers had understood from the beginning. In aerial combat, controlling the vertical dimension means controlling the fight, and when you can dive at 500 miles per hour while your enemy's maximum safe dive speed is 460, you don't just control the vertical dimension, you own it. The Thunderbolt's dive capability had rewritten the rules of air combat. It had turned altitude into an absolute weapon, and it had proven that sometimes the best way to win a dogfight is to refuse to dogfight at all, to strike from above with overwhelming speed and firepower, then climb back to altitude before the enemy can respond. For the German pilots who faced this reality day after day, month after month, there was no answer except caution and survival. The Americans had brought a machine that laughed at conventional tactics, absorbed punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft, and dove at speeds that made escape impossible. The Thunderbolt had become more than just an aircraft. It had become the symbol of American air power in Europe, relentless, overwhelming, and unstoppable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.